All right, welcome back to another episode of Fleet Safety Geeks. Phil, how are you?
I'm doing well, Bob. I hope you're having a good week.
Doing great. We are here starting our multi-part series on developing a fleet safety policy, much anticipated podcast that Phil and I have been planning for a while, and we're very excited this is starting. We have some special guests on today who are going to help us kind of get started on developing that safety policy. We have Cliff Mendolsohn and Erin Gilchrist. Cliff is an attorney with the law firm of Tucker Ellis, LLP in Cleveland, Ohio. Cliff's practice is dedicated to defending fleets in motor vehicle accident litigation and consulting fleets with how to make their fleet policies more resistant to attack and criticism during litigation. Again, I think that we need that because of all of the nuclear settlements that happen against fleets today. It's nice that we have someone defending us. Thanks, Cliff. And I think everybody knows Erin. Erin Gilchrist Rugg is the VP of Fleet Optimization, Fleet Evangelism, sorry about that, at Intellishift, where she serves as the fleet management subject expert from 16 years as an enterprise fleet manager. Erin, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having both of us. It's great.
Yeah, thanks.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Phil, policy. Policy is important. I know that you've helped write policy with a previous role that you've had. When I started at the role I'm in, we had to write a policy, and we just did a major rewrite. So I think there's a lot of intellectual knowledge on this podcast today to kind of help us get us started. What do you have to say about policy, Phil?
Well, I'm trying to think which motivational speaker I once saw. It might have been Zig Ziglar, showing how old I am. And he said, you can't score any baskets if you don't have goals. And that's what it comes down to with a policy. I mean, you have to have those policies because there has to be accountability, right, for the people who are driving the vehicles. And if you don't have a policy, a comprehensive policy, and it needs to be, and we'll get into that, but it needs to be continuously, it needs to be a living document that's updated when it needs to be updated. But yeah, policy is vital.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As I just said, when I got to the company I'm with 8 years ago, I wrote the policy. We just did a major rewrite that was implemented December 1st of last year. So it constantly needs to be updated, reviewed. And as it starts getting successful and your numbers go down, maybe it's time to tweak it and kind of really work on your drivers to get them even more accountable, if you will. But a good policy is a framework for any organization to follow, right? If you're just sort of making it up as you go, you're not really getting anything done. Nobody is very consistently being treated the same. They don't know what expectations are of them. So it really helps to have something that everybody can follow. If drivers don't have a clear understanding of what's expected, they're just not going to give you the best results, I don't think.
I love the word expectation, Bob, because they really want the structure. They want us to spell it out. I think people think policy and it's like, oh no, this is something, one more thing we have to think about, one more thing we have to do. But if done right, it should feel natural to them. And the drivers, like I said, the drivers that I've spent time with riding around as they're doing their job, they have given me the feedback that they love structure, they love accountability because they just know what to expect and they can make the choices and understand the consequences when they don't adhere. So I think it's not a scary word. It's a good thing, and expectations are, when clear, are always beneficial.
On my 23rd year, how many times have I heard a driver say, just tell me what you want me to do?
Exactly. I
think it's a really good point, Erin, in that they want that structure. Now, not everybody's going to be happy with it.
No.
That there's some people who are going to disagree with it, but what I found is that the vast majority of them do agree with it.
Yeah.
And as you said, they want that structure because they know what the rules are, then they know what they need to do.
Well, and I think when they can understand what's in it for them, and it's not just about what's in it for the organization. It's what are we hoping that they'll get out of it? And they should feel, if written well and communicated right, they should feel like what we're doing is all designed to keep them safe so they can get home in better condition than they started their workday in every single day and get back to the things that mean the most to them, like their families or their hobbies or whatever it is they do. And they have to know that that's the reason, and the organization has to get behind the fleet manager or the risk manager who is ever implementing these policies, get behind them and say, we want to keep you safe. And that's the messaging, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Communication, communication.
Absolutely.
And that's on all levels.
Yeah. So the last point I wanted to bring up, we want our drivers to be safe and understand policy. If they can't follow the policy, there has to be corrective action, right? We need to be able to change the behavior through corrective action. But those guidelines need to be consistent, right? Again, you can't make up corrective action as you go. It has to be understood, and everybody needs to know what's going to happen if you don't follow the policy.
Right.
Phil, you had an example. Oh, go ahead, Cliff.
I was just going to add. Sorry to interrupt there. I was just going to add. From the litigation perspective, the only thing worse than not having a policy is not following it and doing what is said in the policy. That is something that will certainly be attacked if there is a lawsuit that arises from a motor vehicle accident. So the importance of adhering to the policy and making sure the policy is written in such a way that it is easy for everyone to follow and adhere to it and do what the policy calls for is really important.
Yeah, agreed. 100%.
Excellent point. Great to have an attorney on to give that kind of feedback and point of view, because that's one thing that we don't always think about until we're in litigation.
And that's too late, Bob. It's at that point, right? We haven't done something right if we're trying to look back and say, what did we say we were doing? That's the worst position to be in. So,
yeah, exactly. Hey, Phil, you've done a lot of new hire training, and I know that you've done it with my company. You had a story about the president of the company I'm with coming to the training. What was that?
So I just love this story because it really does show a dedication to adhering to policy, top down. So I received a call from your company, Bob, the environmental health and safety manager. Called me and asked me what I was doing on a certain day. And I looked at the schedule. I said, well, I guess I'm coming out to see you because you have a class that day. He said, yeah, let me tell you what happened. So the CEO of the company had actually had a meeting with his senior staff. The H&S manager was in that meeting. And he said, listen, his policy is you get a violation, you have to go through the driver training. On the way home that night, he got a speeding ticket. And guess who showed up at the class? And what was really cool about that, so got in there, set up the class. Some of the students were coming in, greeting them, and here in walks the CEO. And everybody did like the double take, like, what are you doing here? And he said, you have to go through it? I have to go through it. And he was a fantastic student, by the way. I did the driving with him and everything, was not scared. It was really just a cool moment. And it just shows, top down dedication to that policy. And that is exactly what Cliff was talking about, is that, it has to be adhered to. Once you have that in place, you better be ready to go. And certainly your organization, Bob, ready to go.
So refreshing to hear. That's such a great story, because I was recently talking to some folks within my organization about driver safety policy and such, and helping our clients. And this idea of top-down, support for this type of program, it's more important than anything. I mean, you can have top-down support on fuel policy, on a maintenance policy, but if we're talking about safety policy, that is the most critical thing. If you can get them to buy in on that, that sets the stage for everything else you're going to do as a fleet leader within your fleet. It's kind of like this idea of, and I think we talk about this at some point, is this framework for the organization, not just framework for the policy, but building a framework for when you have to roll something new out. something that is consistent and repeatable and starts with this team of people around you. And I know, Bob, we've talked about, who should be in the room, who are those key players, but getting those key players around you as a fleet leader and influencing them that what you're doing is mission critical. What happens, what can happen if there's not a good driver safety policy, and show those examples, spend time talking about stories like Phil's and stories from other fleet leaders and things you've learned in your experience to say, here are the things that can happen when we don't have a solid safety policy. And then let's not do this out of fear. Let's do it out of, this is the right thing to do for all the reasons that we've already talked about and that we will talk about on this podcast. But I think the critical thing is, if you can build that right team around you, they're going to help you drive those policies and convince the C-suite that, hey, look, I've got this team around me. We're all on board. There's nothing at that point that the C-suite can do but get on board and say, okay, well, thanks for doing all this work. Thanks for getting all the right people in the room. And then that C-suite, whether that's the COO or CFO or CEO, should be all of them, should be giving the communication or video messaging out to the organization to say, here, we've launched the new safety policy, or we've rewritten the new safety policy. Here's what we're talking about. This is mission critical for organization. And by the way, we're going to do all the things necessary, and we're not going to treat ourselves any different than our driver population out there, who are the bread and butter of our service organization, for example, right? So I think once you do that once and it works, then think about all the other things you want to implement in your fleet. Can just continue to use that same team for fuel management and sustainability and maintenance management and all the new things, new tech stacks that you're trying to implement. But getting it right for safety is just, it's just the foundation. I think for every fleet manager to accomplish anything is get it right with safety, and you can get it right with everything else. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah.
That's an excellent point. And that's exactly what we did at the company I'm with now. We developed a fleet safety committee, C-levels, operations management, HR, risk, legal, fleet, everybody. We all got together. We all got into a room. We all looked at a lot of different things. We stole policy from here. We told the stories, but everybody was involved from the beginning. We didn't have a meeting until everybody was in the room. And, as hard as it is to find calendar time with everybody, we had to do that because everybody had to contribute and give that level of input. We developed a safety policy. We got it out. It was actually the entire fleet policy. Safety policy was just a portion of it, but it was the fleet safety committee meeting. Once we were done, we just turned it into the fleet steering committee meeting, right? So it stayed there as the resources that I could bounce off of, to let them know, here's how we did annual year-end numbers. Here's what's going to happen next year. Here's what's going on because of supply chain shortages. Everybody knows, and we can all get together and get this going on. So that's a really, really good point. In your experience, Erin, have you developed something like that? How does somebody who's never had that approach a C-level person and say, hey, I need you in a meeting with me and all these other people? What's the best way to get that started?
Yeah, I feel like it seems daunting at first, but I think the biggest thing that a fleet manager has to do to prepare for something like that is have numbers, right? Have data, have information. There's so many great resources out there. Phil, an awesome resource to be able to pull together that storyline, that opening communication, some ROI data about, the what ifs and what can be for your fleet if you do not have a solid policy. And then obviously some anecdotes from someone like, Cliff would be awesome. So have those things built and ready before you go to the C-suite and say, or this greater steering committee, like you said, Bob, HR, risk, legal, everyone, ops, and say, okay, here's what we want to do. Here's why we need to do it. And have your ducks in a row so that there's that data and information that's convincing, so that it makes your job as an influencer a little easier, right? Ducks in a row.
And I agree with that. And one point I would add and to keep in mind is those communications that you have regarding safety will, again, if there's litigation, I'm always kind of, the lawyers are always looking at this from the negative perspective. I apologize. I'm not this much of a negative person, but if there's a lawsuit, the plaintiffs will ask for communications regarding policy and internal communications regarding the development of the policy and the implementation of the policy. So I agree with Erin. It's really important. Gather the data, gather the information, gather the numbers. Those discussions sometimes are better had in meetings as opposed to letters and emails and those sorts of communications. It's better to discuss that information and that data rather than creating paper trails, because you have to evaluate that data. It's just so easy for plaintiffs to take those communications out of context, to try to make it into everything's a money decision by the corporate defendant. So just be mindful of that component to it, and what you say and what you put in writing. I saw an attorney had a little sign in their office once, and it said, Dan says if no one is watching, type emails as if it will appear in a deposition. So it's just one of those lessons to keep in mind, that when you have those conversations, it's sometimes better to do in a meeting.
Well, and
context.
those are excellent points, Bob. And you mentioned, or Phil, or Cliff actually, and you mentioned, Bob, that you did those exact things, right? You guys meet in person. But I think that when you're trying to frame this up, again, I'll go back to show you care, right? It's all about your intentions. And it's not like, hey, it's because we had this fatality or because we have too many accidents. It is more about to avoid and potentially eliminate accidents with high severity or accidents altogether, so that we can keep our drivers safe. This is why we're doing this. And always do it from the angle of people. And I think that whether you're talking to your insurance broker and trying to reduce, your claim, your, cash outlay, your premiums, or your, deductible, if you're self-insured, whatever you're trying to do, it's super important to always go from the heart, because we as fleet leaders, and I know everybody on this call really does care about our drivers and their safety. And it's not just about your brand or the bottom line. Those are all, collateral damage when we get in big accidents. It's the driver, his safety and getting home to his family. That's the most important thing. So, I get what Cliff's saying, but I also know how important it is that if you frame it up around the care for the driver, I think you can't go wrong there,
And I agree completely. And I'll talk in more detail later on about the importance of building a safety story for the fleet that you can have ready to go when defending a lawsuit. And so much of it is the ability to humanize the corporate defendant, to show that the company is made up of people who care about each other. They care about the communities in which they work, in which they operate. And so I think that's an excellent way to describe is what the point I was trying to make is when you are crafting these communications, it's important to have that sort of message and come from that angle, from that direction, that this is about safety of our drivers. It's about safety of our communities, and having that sort of message internally will make it easier for the company, if they are at some point in a lawsuit and defending a lawsuit, to be able to explain to a jury, this is where we're coming from. This is why we're doing what we're doing. The why behind the policy is really important. So I think that's an excellent point.
Culture of safety, that's not sort of like a buzzword anymore. It is a real vision, a real mission for organizations. And when you can show that, you have consistency across all programs and policies centered on safety, centered on people, that's got to be helpful as well, to really have that culture. And I'm sure that goes a long way in the courtroom too, to have it be consistent and real,
Yeah, and I remember a number of years ago, I did a presentation called The Forgotten Side of Safety. And there are organizations, they maybe have manufacturing, and there's a lot of manufacturing safety, slip, trip, fall, hard-toe shoes, helmets and all that. But there are a number of organizations that don't give consideration to probably their greatest exposure as far as safety are the people who drive their vehicles or drive for their organizations. And that's another good point in when trying to put policy forward, is that, listen, you're taking care of those folks, but what about these people who are in a very dangerous situation every time they get behind the wheel? I remember working with a company that was a mining company, and they determined, they were a copper mine. They determined that it was much more dangerous for their employees to drive to the mine than what it was to work in the mine. So that's, I think, a very good point in that, saying, hey, let's not forget about the people who are driving the vehicles. And that's, I think, how you can utilize that to bring forward your safety message.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. So we're getting a lot of good points here. And anybody that's tuning into this podcast and saying, when are they going to talk about writing this policy? We're not there yet. This is really just getting started. There's a lot we need to do. Cliff is going to talk more about, developing a safety story. You need to develop, and as Erin was talking about, you've got to talk about things, in the background, put an ROI together, put the stories together, put everything together so that you know what you're going to try and reach. You can't just take somebody's policy and say, oh, I took this policy from company A, and now I'm just going to implement it. It has to work for your organization. It has to work for what's going to happen. And having these conversations are really important. Erin, I asked you about how do you approach a C-level person? You said it can be very daunting. And I got to tell you, it was for me as well. I was new to a company, and I'm going to go up to the president and CEO and say, hey, can you be on this meeting with me and everybody else? Yeah, it's very daunting. It's very, that can be kind of frightening, for some people, especially new to an organization. But I got to tell you, safety happens to be a core value of the company I work for, so that made it a little bit easier. But, it turns out that this person was just another person. He does care about the employees and did want to make sure people were safe. And I think that was very helpful. But the more we started meeting and the more we got into it, everybody was engaged. And we were getting so much done, and it's so worth it. So if you have not developed some sort of stakeholder meeting where you're going to get together and start working on this, I just recommend that's where you start. And then once you do that and you start getting through it, you're going to need to have a portion of your policy that deals with people who aren't your employees yet. Now, that's going to sound pretty weird, but if you develop a great safety policy for your employees who are already there, you're hopefully going to have great, safe drivers. But what about the person that you're recruiting or that you've hired on who has a bad driving record? Phil, I think you said this once to me before, but if you hire a bad driver, you're going to get a bad driver?
Exactly. Why hire a problem?
Yeah, right. You just have a problem you have to deal with.
Fairly simple to me, but
yeah,
they do. Oh, well, they're going to be a great salesperson. Really?
It's the same as the risk you put yourself at when you identify behaviors with the driver and then you address the driver and the behaviors don't improve, and the policy that you spend so much time writing, you let it fail you because you've kept that driver on because, wow, they're your most productive, technician at whatever they, do at their vocational work. I've seen it happen, and I'm sure we all have. And that is worse, I realize, but then bringing on a new hire and not properly training them, or knowing they have issues because you've run an MVR or some sort of background check and still bringing them on because you're desperate in environment of really needing workers,
Right.
you're asking for a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to Cliff's point where, if you don't follow your policy, you're going to lose in court. But Cliff, you're also going to tell us, you talked about developing a safety story. We're talking about background checks. We need to run good background checks. The company I work with, everybody from HR, and right now, everybody's either quitting or hiring, or we're growing, and there's tons of new hires coming. Every 5 minutes, I get an email from HR. Can you grade this MBR for me and tell me if they're a good hire? Listen, I have other things to do than just look at MBRs and tell you if this person should be hired. So I actually developed like a little scoring system. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Part of it's the negligent entrustment. What if you hire somebody where they have a DUI? And it's like, but Erin, you mentioned it's a really tough environment. We need to get people on board. Let's bring them on anyway. I think there's something called negligent entrustment you're going to talk about a little bit here, Cliff. But we developed something where I was able to create a matrix and then just send it back to HR. And now the HR people during the background checks can look at it and say, oh, have they had a minor infraction in the past 3 years? And then it continues on. It's like a decision tree where they just continue moving forward. At some point, it either says, yes, they're a good hire, or yes, but it needs senior management approval to let them know they're going to start at a high risk or medium risk driver. Or no, absolutely, we cannot bring this aboard. And it makes it so much easier. It's in black and white. It's actually a standard operating procedure because making it policy would have been very difficult. But I'm sure that they're also looking for some leeway there. But I got to tell you, it's working. The HR people who look at the MBRs love it. And they are able to make that decision without having any kind of gray area or different HRs with different business units making different decisions. So, Cliff, you talked about a safety story. What do you got there? What are you going to do as far as a safety story?
So you've mentioned, Bob, the nuclear verdicts that we've been seeing more of in the legal realm, and I have done presentations on that. That's easily an hour presentation in and of itself as to how and why those verdicts happen. But one of the main reasons, there was a couple of recent studies have shown, one of the main reasons is plaintiffs are really good at telling stories. At the end of the day, trials are about who tells a better story. Who is able to move the jury with the story. And plaintiffs, particularly in personal injury litigation, are often in a very good position of being able to tell a sympathetic story about an individual who has been injured and how their life has changed. And what happens oftentimes in lawsuits is the defendant is forced to defend, the accident and how it happened, and it becomes a very technical defense. And what companies are realizing, and what attorneys who represent defendants are realizing, is you have to do a better job of telling the defense story. As I said before, companies and the clients I've worked with and the companies that I've worked with, they're made up of dozens upon dozens of people who truly care about safety, who are working towards safety every day in, day out. That's what they're doing. And it's really important for a company when defending a motor vehicle accident lawsuit to be able to tell that story, to be able to show what the company does day in, day out, the people who are doing this work day in, day out. So a jury can understand, an accident did happen, but a jury can understand all the steps the company does on a daily basis to not only keep their drivers safe, but to keep, others on the road safe. And it's really important to personalize the company and to develop this story. So, as Bob was talking earlier, they've put together a safety committee. I'm not sure if that was the exact term, Bob, but you have the people there. It's really important to be able to identify the people in your company who can help you tell that story in front of a jury, who can help tell a jury all the things the company is doing from hiring the driver to training the driver to supervising the driver to disciplining the driver if necessary, at all steps along the way, to be able to explain everything that the company's doing day in, day out. So it's much harder for the plaintiff to try to distort and paint the picture that this is a company that doesn't care. And so gathering the right people, gathering the right documents, gathering all of that information that can help you tell the story, and hiring obviously is one really important aspect of that. What is the company doing to vet drivers, and how is what the company is doing, how is that reasonable? Why does it make sense? Why, Bob, that matrix you set up, that helps show that you are being reasonable in your hiring practices, that you have thought about these issues, and you've given tools for other people in the organization to implement what you would like them to do, and that helps the company hire well-qualified individuals. So you want to be able to tell that sort of story at every step along the way when it comes to driver safety, and it's really important to do it with the right people. Having people who are good at telling that story is important. Having the documents to back up the story, so it's not just Joe Smith coming in here and telling you how great the company is, but there's documents that you can show a jury to support and show all the steps that are taken. So that's what we're talking about from a safety story. It's really important to be able for a company to put that sort of story together.
Awesome points, Cliff. I would add that, and I know this is a controversial topic, but at the end of the day, if you don't have tools and technology that can help exonerate your drivers, in my opinion, as a fleet leader for so many years, you're missing the boat. I can't tell you how many times, with the fleet that I was managing, this moving billboard for this big company with lots of success, we were targeted. And I remember a time when we had a driver, someone called in and said that we had a near miss with a driver who was in a school zone speeding. Well, I could prove that we didn't even have a vehicle in a 10-mile radius of that school zone during that time on that day. I mean, so technology can be our friend. And I know, from a legal perspective, there are ups and downsides to having AI video dash cams. But I think the thing that I'd like to point out about the tech is the tech builds positive driver behavior. We've seen it. We've seen it for years in fleets, and we've seen it be hugely successful in reducing accidents and risk. And the big thing that I've seen in my career is reducing accident severity. So when we do get in an accident, it's not something that is, causing catastrophe or fatality. So, I think that we could talk about tech for a long time, but generally speaking, what I've seen in my experience is that tech forms good habits, and it helps drivers develop good driving habits when maybe they're someone who's prone to speed or hard corner or harsh brake. Those are indicative of other things, right? Risky behavior. They're indicative of people who take risks in their life. They're also indicative of distraction. So whether you have telematics or AI video cams or both, advanced driver assistance systems of some sort really save lives. And so I'll get off my soapbox on that, but I've seen it work in my career more to the positive. Not just financially for the organization, but certainly that was there, but certainly for drivers driving more safely and only having a small subset of drivers who couldn't get on the program. And then they were gone, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Cliff, you going to say something?
I was just going to add the technology in the telematics. Erin, you kind of raised the point. It is a bit of a double-edged sword from a legal perspective. I have seen telematics programs work amazingly well over time in changing driver behavior and improving the performance of drivers. The one comment I would make from a legal perspective is when that telematics program is implemented, it is so important to have the necessary personnel and support, because the amount of data that is generated and that can be taken out of context in a lawsuit is tremendous. And so it's really important to have the right people and have that technology supported so that that data can be used effectively and people can stay on top of the data. And when the data is showing something with respect to driver safety, that the company can follow up and do the supervision and the additional training and any discipline that is indicated by the data. Because if you don't have that support system in place, you're just generating a whole bunch of data that can and likely will be taken out of context in a lawsuit. So it's really important. Again, it's similar to the policy. Once you have the policy written, you have to enforce it. Once you have the technology, you have to have the necessary support structure to actually follow and keep track of and
that is
act on the information.
I love that point because, data is our best friend or our worst enemy. And everything's discoverable. And Cliff, you said something really, really important. It's about whatever you do, it's got to be part of the policy, right? So if you have tools and technology, they're part of the policy. How you're handling data, how you're handling reporting and analytics. What do you do when you find a driver that's out of scope? All those things should be built into the policy and have that top-down support so that everybody's on board, that when things happen or when we have near misses, that we're addressing near misses like we're addressing accidents. It's just so, I agree 100% with the points you made. I think you can't in this day and age operate a fleet completely safely, considering distraction and all the things going on without some kind of tool and technology. But again, it is all about what you do with the data and the information that you get from it that will make or break you. So those are excellent points.
What we often tell our clients as well is to be clear up front as far as explaining why you are using a particular technology. So, for example, I'll go back to telematics. We've had companies say, look, we're implementing telematics. It's not a perfect system. We're not comfortable making discipline and firing decisions off of this new technology that, sometimes it's reporting speeding and the driver saying they were on an access road, they weren't, or they were on the highway, not on the access road, and it had them on the access road and there's a speeding incident and this, that, or the other. So we've had companies say right now, as we're just adopting it, we're using it for training purposes. We are using this for education purposes. We're not using it for qualification of drivers, for firing drivers, and of course, in egregious circumstances, but we are using it primarily to figure out who needs additional training. And having that communication up front as to why they're using it makes it much easier, at least from in my context, in defending that policy and the use of that data and what the company did or didn't do with that data when there's an explanation as to how and why the company is using the data. So that's I think, an important point as well.
Yeah, I think you're both saying that, you need to have things in place before you go there. It's I always make the comparison between, like running MVRs, motor vehicle record checks. I've said it a million times. It's worse to know and not do something than it is not to know. Not running motor vehicle records is a terrible thing. But running them, finding out you have problems and not doing something about it, it's even worse. Yeah. And Cliff, you know that everything gets discovered. I, Cliff, certainly don't have your experience in court, but I reconstruct crashes. I've had to go to court a number of times for crashes I've investigated. And the joke I make is I say, they'll find out. They're going to look, they'll say, hey, look, we have his kindergarten records here. He did not play well with others. And he's driving their car. And that's an exaggeration, but not much. So you have to be prepared. And Erin, you're exactly right. with policy and then the people in place to take care of those things.
If you're going to use technology too, and Erin, you said it, make sure that technology and how you're going to manage it is in your safety policy. It needs to be there because, again, discoverable, you need to do it. But you also need to make sure that framework is there so you know what you're doing. And we keep talking about telematics, but I think we've talked about dash cams and how you manage dash cams. I've had drivers have something reported, and they came back and said, well, here's my dash cam that proves I didn't do that. And I said, why do you have a dash cam? And it's like, well, because it was cheap and it's going to help me in case somebody hits me and I can prove it was their fault. I said, it can also be used against us if it proves that you were at fault. So we can't just have people putting technology in the vehicles that's against the company policy. We need to make sure that if there's going to be something out there, it's researched, it's understood, it goes to the fleet steering or safety committee, and everybody understands how it's going to be used, and then policy is developed behind it. If you're going to have dash cams, have policy, and then put it out there and tell people how to use it. If you have drivers that have dash cams, tell them to take it out until you have policy. I think that's just really important. It's just another piece of technology that just keeps getting developed that doesn't cost much, and people think it's going to save their
good
butts.
points.
So, Cliff, I mentioned it earlier, and I'm hoping you can kind of, talk about it a little bit more, but, negligent entrustment. You've told us how to develop a safety story and putting all that stuff together, but what if we do hire somebody that we're aware that they did something wrong in the past? Is there any kind of liability if that similar incident happens again?
That's a good question. So negligent entrustment can take a number of different forms. I kind of group all of those claims under the umbrella of negligent entrustment, but there's negligent hiring claims, there's negligent supervision claims, there's negligent training claims, and they all kind of go together. From like the hiring perspective, for example, and I should step back and say the standard of care that a defendant is held to in pretty much every state in a negligence case is reasonableness. Did the defendant act reasonable? Did they act in the way that a reasonable person in his or its position would have acted under similar circumstances? A defendant does not have to be perfect. Now, plaintiffs have a number of tools they use and strategies they use to try to paint the picture that a defendant should have been perfect, that a fleet should have been perfect. And they do that for a number of obvious reasons. And there are many plaintiff lawyers who are excellent at doing that and kind of imposing this inaccurate burden on the defendant or on the fleet in a lawsuit. But the actual law in most states is that the defendant company had to have acted reasonably in its practices. So obviously there are nobody is perfect. Companies are going to be hiring drivers. You do your MVR and you see sometimes that there is a history. There are prior accidents, there are prior citations. The companies and the fleets, what the fleet has to do is demonstrate that it acted reasonably in its hiring decision of that person. So having policy in place, having a matrix, having a decision tree, having something in place that can be used by the company to make those hiring decisions goes a very, very long way to being able to demonstrate that the company acted reasonably. People can and will disagree on some of the details on some of those decision tree processes or what have you. But if you can show the how and the why of what you did in the hiring practice, and it wasn't simply ad hoc and, depending on whose desk the decision fell on, and it wasn't arbitrary and the hiring decisions haven't been inconsistent over time, then you've demonstrated reasonableness. And that is our goal when we talk about developing a safety story, is if you can do that at each step along the way, at hiring, training, supervision, discipline, if you can be able to explain at each step what you do, why you do it, how you do it, then you go a long way to just being able to show a jury and tell that story, we are reasonable. We are safe. This is what we do. So that's kind of how how that safety story fits in the hiring component.
That's interesting. So I've always operated because people have told me, if you know somebody has a DUI, don't ever hire them because you're in trouble. That's not necessarily the case, though. So if you're taking reasonable action to look at something and put some sort of guideline behind it, then you're probably reasonable and doing the right thing. So if somebody had a DUI yesterday, you probably don't want to hire that person. But if somebody had a DUI 7 years ago and your reasonableness test is, has there been a major infraction in the last 3 years, at least you're showing the reasonableness and it's okay, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Ultimately, a jury will make that decision in the litigation context. But you being able to explain, why you still hired that person. The DUI was 7 years ago. They've had a clean record since then, and maybe even be able to explain the person went, to special training after that DUI, or they went through a program. You've had the discussion with them about the importance of it and what happens if there's any further infraction. Just whatever the policies are, then yeah. I mean, otherwise, there's a ton of people who are never going to be able to be hired. Same thing with citations and prior accidents. So it's just a matter of being able to explain and show that it was thought through. It wasn't arbitrary. Safety was in mind. Like you said, if that DUI was last week, that's probably not a good hiring decision. If it was 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, and you can show what you've done to address that issue with them, and then it's an easier explanation. Again, at the end of the day, in the litigation context, the jury's going to ultimately make that decision. You want to arm them with as much information as you can as to why your action was reasonable.
Yeah, makes sense. Not to scare anybody, but you could get taken to court and have juries actually reviewing your policies. That's kind of why we're talking about it from this level. So it's really important that you look at some of these things, and it's really great to have you on, Cliff. I really appreciate that, and Erin, to have your perspective on this too, with your experience. So I think it's really important that people know. Yeah,
I mean, it's like you talked about having legal in the room. I mean, on your steering committee, Bob. I mean, it's just really important they have that perspective that we don't have, just like HR does, and the risk or EHS team has. I mean, fleet managers, we can do a lot. We know a lot. We have a lot of experience, but we aren't experts in all of these areas. But sometimes we're forced to wear all these hats. And if you, again, it's just surround yourself with all those SMEs who can help you think of all the things that you wouldn't have thought of. And those are all the things that Cliff mentioned. Seem scary, but super important. And if you develop the right kind of policy, then you're going to be able to avoid a lot of these things or help yourself when you're in a situation where you happen to have to go to court. So yeah, it's so important.
Wait, Erin, are you trying to say that a fleet manager is not a financial analyst, a vehicle engineer, an HR specialist, and a legal representative about the company?
Although I know, I'm looking at you guys, and we do this all the time. And I love talking to as many fleet managers as possible, always saying like, hey, you're not alone in this. Just surround yourself with the right people. And Bob, it seems like that's been really successful for you, and it's been successful for me in the past too.
People do treat us.
I worked for a pharmaceutical for a number of years, and I have to tell you, I had legal and HR on speed dial. They knew me, I knew them. Dealing with about 3,000 drivers, and they can do some things. So you have to partner with the people within your organization.
Yeah,
sometimes it's impossible to make everyone happy. I'm sure, as you guys know. I mean, sometimes the legal considerations and the HR considerations and the fleet consideration, they can't all be perfectly achieved. And it's just a matter of talking it through and balancing all of those considerations and coming up with something that makes the most sense. And a lot of times it's, Erin said, it can be frightening or daunting, but a lot of it is also sometimes just common sense.
Yeah.
Can you explain yourself and your policies if you have to? And just being prepared to do that is helpful and important.
Yeah. So great. We've talked about developing a fleet safety committee or steering committee with all the different stakeholders that can assist. We've talked about developing a safety story, talked about negligent entrustment. So the next step before we end this podcast, as an introduction to developing a safety policy is, once you finish the background check and you've identified the person and they're eligible to get hired, your next logical step is to do some sort of training for that new hire. You need to make sure that again, it's setting the expectations. You train them to what the expectations of the company are. Maybe do some behind the wheel, certainly some in classroom or at least online, something to let them know that here's some of the expectations that we're going to have. Here's the tools to help you get there. Phil, you've got a lot of experience on new hire training. Why don't you give the 30,000 foot level or lower if you want?
Yeah. So why not do it even before they get the keys? Right. So the policy I had in place was, before you get the keys, you have to read the policy, take a test on the policy, sign off on the policy.
Yeah.
Then you have to take safety training. And, and what it did is it got everybody reading off the same page.
Right.
And that was, again, before they got the keys. And you know what it did also? Erin, I think you mentioned, you got to create that culture, right? Right up front, they knew this is very, very important. The policy was in place. They had to, adhere to it. And guess what? The managers that they reported to, the field managers, I always say, they are the key to the whole thing, right? If you have to get them on board and let them understand that communication thing. They knew that their people weren't going to be out there until they got this all done. So they were on the drivers saying, hey, you need to get this taken care of. It has to be part of the policy. Set that expectation.
The best
right
start to your story that Cliff was talking about. It's the most natural step to your story is, hey, we get it going before we even let them operate the most dangerous tool we'll ever give them, which is a vehicle. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, oftentimes one of the main themes you hear from the plaintiffs in a lawsuit is the company put profits over safety. And if you can demonstrate, as Phil just noted, that it was safety first, safety before them doing any work, that they had to read the policy, take a test, do some training before they were ever given keys, that undermines the profits before
That's
safety.
an investment. It's quite an investment to do that training.
First.
And you're right, Cliff. I think that, a couple of hour training, you have the testing, or you're probably, partnering with a company who provides this training and the testing and all the things. That's a huge investment for a company to make. But I think one of the best things you'll ever do, is anything proactive in your fleet, but certainly as it relates to safety.
Yeah. If you're listening to this podcast and you're developing a safety policy from scratch and you have nothing, it's important, and you're going to start doing some new hire training as part of your policy, it's important that you reset the clock and train all of your existing drivers as well. Don't forget them, hold them to the same policy, put them behind the wheel, or that training that you develop, even if it's expensive. Cliff, you just mentioned, a lawsuit that you're found guilty could be very expensive, right? Which is cheaper? Maybe somebody that was injured or worse, or spending the money on keeping your drivers safe and the public safe. So any last thoughts on new hire training as part of your safety policy?
I think there's a best practice out there that there's something ongoing. Right. There are a lot of things that drivers learn how to do, use a fuel card, learn how to use payment solutions, do all kinds of things. And of course, all the things they have to do for their vocationary work. But I think the most critical thing is their safe driving practices. So it's kind of like if you're going to have them retrain on new vehicles they're going to work on, if they're a mechanic, or all the things that we do for continuing education for vocational workers, why on earth wouldn't we do some sort of annual policy review, quick quiz, and sign off on an annual basis? I mean, it could be an investment of 15 minutes, a half an hour per the associate. I know it's an investment. It goes back to two things. One, everybody's reading off the same playbook on a consistent basis. Two, you're continuing to build this awesome safety story so that if you find yourself in a pinch, you can say, we do care because this is what we also do. We don't tell this, you don't have someone do this training day one and then 10 years later, they're like, what safety policy, right? It's got to be, annual or maybe a couple of times a year. I think it's critical to do the retraining, a quiz, and a sign off on at least an annual basis.
Erin, you have just introduced episode 2 of this podcast. But no, very, very good points. We are going to talk in episode 2, kind of as an intro to what's going to happen there, is what you do with drivers once they are drivers, right? You need to do their MVR. You need to at least do an annual MVR, biannual MVR. But if there's different types of MVR, and it goes to court and you're questioned why you didn't do MVR monitoring that's available now, you could get challenged on that as well. But don't just run MVRs. Do the training. Erin, you said before, it was a culture. We're developing a culture. Just giving somebody a new hire training once isn't culture. Culture is doing something over and over again, right? So, we call it proactive training, right? If you give somebody training after they've had an accident and award them points and call them medium risk, you're reactive. That's reactive training, right? So doing some proactive training before something happens can avoid that. And that's exactly what we do at my company, right? We develop the safety of culture. We send out safety blasts. Fleet sends 1 week, health and safety sends trips and falls and building safety the next week. And we rotate every other week. Once a month, you have to take an online safety module, right? 20 minutes long, takes you a few minutes. You have to get a score of at least 90 to pass, right? So it's ongoing and it's developing that safety culture. They're constantly always aware and thinking of safety. So Erin, thank you for introducing episode 2. We will have some people on to talk about that, but you're absolutely right on that point. So listen, most of these episodes that Phil and I do, we try and keep to 30 minutes. We had 4 people on this call. This is the safety policy series is going to be more than 30 minutes each. We have a lot to talk about. But we're at that point. Can we just go around real quick and anybody give some last thoughts on what you want to say before we end this? How about Phil? Or Cliff? Sure.
Sure. I would say from the safety story perspective, a couple of really important points. You want to put that story together outside the context of a lawsuit. There's deadlines in lawsuits. It's very difficult to put together a comprehensive story in the middle of a lawsuit. It is much better to take your time and craft that story, find the right people, find the right documents to support your story, to do that outside the context of litigation. You want that sitting on your shelf. And unfortunately, if you ever have to use it, to be able to pull it down, adjust it, tweak it based on what the case is about. But you want to have, 80, 90% of that story ready to go. And that's well thought out and it's complete. And when you put that story together, sometimes you find the soft spots. It's better to do that ahead of time and know where your soft spots are and try to fix them, but also know where they are. And that will be incredibly helpful in the course of a lawsuit. And just also going, I know this is a multi-part series. It's really important for that story to address every single aspect of driver safety because the plaintiffs will make the case about whichever part is your weakest. So it's really important to have that comprehensive story developed.
Cliff, I really like the idea of the safety story. I like it a lot. It would be nice if you would, and I can help arrange this, even going to a NAFA I&E. I know that we've talked about some chapters, but I think an I&E would be really good. Going to a safety conference, the fleet safety conference that's coming up, or even at AFLA, and just, sitting around talking with people and kind of getting this idea out there. It's kind of new to me. We do something similar, but it's not as concise as what you've talked about. And I really like the idea. It'd be cool if you could train that to other fleets. We'll talk about that.
Happy to do it. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to.
Great.
Starting that here, Bob. We started that here.
We did. Yeah, exactly. I kind of feel like our podcasts, Phil, are little I&E sessions every week. So I like it. So, Erin, how about you? Any
along the
last
same
thoughts,
lines
anything you want to
as
contribute?
Cliff was saying, proactivity is everything. And we talked about some great topics today. I've enjoyed the conversation. And I would just like to say, hey, if there's anybody out there who, is saying, gosh, I want to get started on this. We're all here as a resource. I'll offer myself as a resource to the fleet community to help out with building any sort of type of plan for your fleet. But of course, I have a passion for safety, so would love to help if anyone out there listening needs it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Erin. That's awesome. I would do the same. I'm happy to share my policy. And if you can make a better policy than me, please share it back with me. Phil, what have you got?
That's what's cool about this industry, right? And I've been involved in fleets for going on decades, right? And the people are willing to share. They're willing to help each other. So I'll just offer that out there as well. If any of us can assist you, it's so important. And Bob, we say almost every episode, we hate crashes. And that's why we're doing this. I mean, they ruin lives. And if you can put some policy in place and get a culture going and get your people home safe every night, it's worth all the effort. It is worth all the effort. Crashes cut a very, very wide swath. And listen, yeah, it does come down to ROI. It does, it has to make financial sense. But Erin, you made the point earlier. Get to the human side of it. It's people need to go home safe every day. And if you have a good policy in place, you're enforcing it. I'll tell you, I had more people when I put policy in place that said thank you than said, what do you mean I have to do this? People were appreciative of it because you showed care. So
good points.
Care. Get some good policy in place.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone. With that, I think that we are going to end this podcast, first series of this multi-series safety policy podcast. So just to plug our podcast for a little bit, we do have a YouTube channel now. It's Fleet Safety Geeks. Please go out there, find it. This will be out there. We are trying to figure out how to get the Spotify to do the video podcast. We released it last week and nobody could get the video. But I swear I followed all the steps to the T. They need to work on their steps. But we'll get it out there. And of course, there will be an audio version on all the various platforms as well. So again, thank you to our very special guests, Erin Gilchrist Rugg, Cliff Mendelssohn. Thank you so much for being on. Phil, thank you for everything you contribute. So I appreciate that. With that, have a great week, everybody. And be sure to check in next week for the second episode in this series.